instead of really enjoying and living in the idiosyncrasies that exist for our type of institution. To me, it's like coffee shops. You know, the local coffee shop has a unique advantage that comes distinctly from not being Starbucks. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of small museums have this approach where we try and be like Starbucks, you know, be like the big guys, be like the corporate guys, instead of embracing our idiosyncrasies.
That's great. Thank you for that. That's inspiring for all of us who work in those circumstances. I would like to hear, really start hearing from the audience and questions for the panel. We have a lot of good voices here, and I would ask you to come down to the mic as Graham has just done. And please direct your questions to any one of us, but especially to our panel.
Sure. Hi, Graham Venture from the Birmingham Museum of Art. I was struck by the image that Seb showed from the rock concert, talking about the immersive experience. And I wonder, and this is a question for really all of you, are there some art experiences that are simply off limits for interactive engagements in terms of electronics and things that are brought in? I think about my experience going to the Rothko Chapel at the Menil and how that was an immersive experience, and there were no video screens, there was no sound, there was nothing flashing at me like a theme park. It was just the experience of the art in a contemplative setting. So I'm wondering, playing devil's advocate a little bit, are there some sacred spaces within art museum curatorial practice that we should be preserving or offering simultaneously with the other types of experiences? Or is there a way of having interactive experiences with things that we've otherwise seen as sacred and off limits previously?
To answer that, to start at that, I think yes, but we need to assert why. We can't assume that that all our audiences, particularly if we want more diverse audiences, come with the realization that it's better to have your devices off or whatever it is. What's interesting about the Savages, the image I used of theirs, is that it aligns with their philosophy that is in the rest of their work. So as perhaps if you're a fan, then you understand and you buy into that. I think that's really the challenge, is that we need to say why. And we need to, and I also see in, media production now that in television and drama, people are designing for second screen experiences because they know that people are watching TV shows, particularly with a second screen, doing some other things. Now you can design for that, or you can ignore it. And I think if you design for it, you can design it out as well. But it needs to be a design choice.
And I think there's room, it's about intention, as in any creative process. If you need to be cognizant of intention in some ways. And you can design you can design a space and an experience for people to have, of course, a conversation with the work itself and not with anyone around you, or even a conversation with yourself or your own creative spirit. And that requires a different kind of environment than one where you're having conversations with others.
Thank you. Next, hi.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Putney from the Toledo Museum of Art, and I'm really responding to Catherine's earlier question about how you can work some of these ideas into your existence without having monumental changes. And I know you're going through a total change, but we decided to start with 3 galleries that we had a temporary exhibition in, and they were regular collection galleries. But we took advantage of the fact that we had cleared them out, and so we made an experiment of 3 galleries of sculpture. And it was interesting because normally a curator has his or her galleries, and so we got all of the curators together to choose the objects for those galleries. And we decided to ask the public to look at them by form rather than, and themes, rather than looking at them, chronologically or any other way. And so it was an interesting experiment. We're still in the early days of it, but we have one gallery where we put couches, and we created a game with 2 iPads that would, looking at 2 sculptures that were very close to the couches. We also moved part of the library into the galleries because the library is increasingly coming under fire for non-relevance and no one using it. So we brought the books to the gallery. So far, one iPad was stolen, but the books have not been stolen yet.
Of course.
So we're,
I think that's,
we're
Carol,
trying
I
something
think that's
different.
a really good approach to try something. What we found is we don't do a lot of tech stuff because we, the cost, we do guide by sell and those kinds of things, but we do very low-tech things, and we find through evaluation, which is a really key piece of this whole process, that it's not resonating, we jettison it. And, yes,
true.
we've put human resources behind it, but we remain very flexible about that.
Yeah,
so
we
thank
worked
you.
with our education department, and there's about every way possible that you can have somebody approach sculpture with hands-on things, with different kinds of educational techniques. So
Thank you.
we'll keep you posted.
Okay, thank
Great.
you. Hi.
Hi, my name's Tracy. I'm from the Flint Institute of Arts, and my question is for Nina or the panel in general. Last year we did an exhibition on political cartoons and chose just the label text just to be the artist's name because they were all untitled and the date and the country that they were from. It was international political cartoons. And as the interactive or participatory part of the exhibition, we had post-it notes where people could write their comments. And what was really interesting, what we found is not only did people post their thoughts, but then people were posting their thoughts to other people's thoughts. And
yes,
there was
exactly.
a dialogue in between visitors and quite it was the election year, so there was quite a lot of things pertaining to that, both globally and locally in Flint, Michigan. But my question is, what do you do after? I mean, we had just such an abundance of notes, almost 1,000 notes, which for us we didn't even expect that. It was just plastered, sort of overwhelming the objects, but we just let it happen. But once all these notes came down, what do you do with it? So I was interested what Nina did. What did you do with the memory jars, or is it just something that we just move on from it?
Good question. Nina, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, so that's a great story, and I think this is a question we deal with a lot here. So we think about different projects in very specific ways. So for example, when we had a love exhibition and we were doing a post-it project around people sharing their breakup stories, some of the stories were funny, some of them were really serious, they were all fabulous. But we really decided we're going to treat this as a piece in the temporary exhibition the way we would treat any of this loaned work. And by that I mean it will exist during the show and then it will not exist anymore. Now in this case, obviously there's no loan form and we weren't returning post-its to people, but we did think about, okay, we think of this as part of this experience but not as a collection activity. There have been other projects like the memory jars where we realized that there were a lot of people who were interested in actually continuing to own their jar, and so when people made jars, we just had a really simple clipboard in the space where we just said, if you like to be notified at the end of the exhibition to come and pick up your jar, put your email address here. I would say, probably about a quarter of people put their email address down, and about half of those people actually showed up and picked up their jars. The rest of them we recycled, but only after a graduate student who was doing a master's thesis on the jars, recorded and coded all kinds of content into them. So we really look at it differently depending project is. We've also done projects where we have actually collected from visitor contributions. I think that for us, what's been important is just to always be transparent about whatever we're doing with these things. So often, for example, we're taking photos of the objects and putting them, say, on Facebook, and so we just like to legally says, every week we pick some of these on our Facebook page, or at the end of this exhibition, these projects will go on the page, whatever it is that people are curious about. But we
Nina, we're having a little, sorry to interrupt you, we're having a little trouble hearing. I'm sorry about that.
Sorry for that.
Just maybe we can correct that.
Okay.
But yes,
Maybe somebody
these
can answer in the meantime.
thank you. These practices do create a lot of stuff. Tina or Seb, do you have thoughts about that? Or
About the kind of after effects?
yeah, the after effect.
I think Nina really knows this well, but I think it's a really good question because it has to be part of the design. You don't want to ask for something really profound from somebody or meaningful and then have it just sit there or have it just languish or have it feel like an afterthought. So I think that as you get better at this, that becomes part of the design experience, where if people are making something that's clearly valuable to them on whatever terms you define value, it has to be integrated in some way into the program, into the project.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the work I was doing with my teams at the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, we were looking at ways that we would archive visitor materials as part of the archiving of the exhibition, and then for some pieces in the collection, they would become visitor contributed materials would become part of the object file. Right. Because we only really wanted to ask things that we actually cared about. Right. We didn't want participation that generated things for its own sake, because you need to value, if you value visitors' voices, you should, I think as a museum you also need to value their perpetuation, collection, and what they have to say. Yeah. Otherwise it is just marketing, and I think that there is a challenge in that, during this last 5, 6, 7 kind of years of social media and all of this, we've seen social media become, and a lot of digital projects too, become the domain of marketing alone. And this is really not where the opportunity really lies. But if it moves out of marketing, we need to start treating these things as we would other serious museum business, in quotes.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Catherine Geist from the Baltimore Museum of Art, and participation seems to be a major, I'm sorry, I'm too tall for this mic. Participation seems to be a really major component of what we've been talking about the last 2 days, and I think that if you've attended any of the cocktail hours, you know that it makes all of us exceedingly nervous. Yep. And your panels helped me to kind of put a finger on what makes me so nervous about it. As an Africanist working in Baltimore, which is still a city with racial sort of problems, I'm concerned about 2 things with participation. Participatory events that have open-ended responses seem the most interesting and useful, but I worry about comments in the galleries that are offensive through ignorance and not maliciously intended, and comments that are maliciously intended, and that I have maybe a duty to surveil those. And surveillance is sort of part of what I'm thinking about, in that I also wonder, I was really impressed by the metrics that this Australian museum can collect on visitors, but it also strikes me as a surveillance technology that makes me very uncomfortable in an age when things are increasingly surveilled. And just thinking that it might make people self-conscious in the way that you hesitate to click on something in Netflix because it'll stop showing you, cerebral foreign comedies, and you want to be this cerebral foreign comedy person, Yeah. So I'm a little concerned about, where does surveillance fit into this, both in the data gathering and also in the duty we have to visitors to make the museum a safe space.
Yeah, I mean, I think all digital life is surveillance, and that's something that museums as a topic should be dealing with, and actually museums are a fantastic space to explore surveillance. In fact, everything you do on your phone and on the web and from your email account and on the MoMA Wi-Fi is all trackable. It's the nature of technology. But to the other questions.
I think we need to really step back and look at what's appropriate and what isn't, and why we're doing this work. And if we say to ourselves, this is important work, this dialogic work, the having of conversations and coming to new shared understandings about the world around us, about the world of art, around culture, humankind, we need to figure out ways. Nobody has a magic bullet here, and we need to figure out ways how to have these conversations and to let people have their say, and perhaps not worry or try to censor, or on the other hand, to ask the kinds of questions that elicit authentic conversation that's generative and that's workable and not just expressions of anger or frustration. And I think that's where conversation is an art and it takes practice. And I think just kind of very quickly going back to kind of some of the questions earlier, I think the big elephant in the room for us is that we aren't experimental enough and in our own practice, and that we need to model the creative process in a way and do small experiments and prototypes, and through those learn how to do this work so that when those kinds of conversations come up, we don't just have a knee-jerk reaction that we have to edit that or censor that or that we're going to have something bad going on in the gallery.
Thank you. I think I'm just toggling back and forth here, yeah.
This is in response to your question about what museums are doing, as well as a question to you. Currently, we photograph our entire exhibition with didactics, and the layouts itself, they're pretty traditional, and we post them all on Facebook in albums in their entirety. And it's proven to be a really good outreach tool for tours and visitors as well, because it can kind of customize their visit. My profoundly bad photography maybe makes them come and see the objects.
It's intentionally bad.
Machiavellian.
But I'm a little curious what, making all this information, what your opinions are, what data says, opinion maybe first. I get nervous about data. But how making all this information available has impacted attendance. I mean, our attendance is nowhere near 3 million, for example, and I'd be curious what actual physical participation, how that's affected.
So most of the places that I've worked with around the world have found that more information means more attendance. It changes the nature of the type of attendance and the questions people bring. So very early on, when I was doing a lot of collection release, digitized collection release to the web with a high focus on usability and serendipitous discovery and all those sorts of things, we found that the sort of things people wanted to know about works in our collections changed, because they actually became aware we had things. Shocking, but you know, if I went out to anyone waiting on the street queuing up for MoMA and said, is everything you're going to, is everything MoMA has on show in the museum now, I bet a lot would say yes. They don't realise that museums have so much stuff they never show, and yet we're held in the public trust to preserve these things, in quotes, forever. You know, obviously, I think one of the challenges is that we just don't have enough curatorial staff to support the collections we have.
And it's getting worse.
And it's getting worse, you know, and this is a moment where rather than running away from that challenge, asserting curatorial relevance is done through making things available and being responsive, and that forces us to design new ways to manage that response, to manage the scale of that response, and to focus on the work we should be doing that hasn't been done by anyone else, rather than the work that has. We do not need to be writing more biographies of Picasso. We have thousands of them on the internet. Don't waste your time on that, right? But we need to identify where those opportunities are, and I think that's how we can deal with this challenge. Scale is a great opportunity. It's also a hugely threatening tidal wave of people, but that's a good problem to have.
That's a good problem to have.
Thank you. Mark?
Hi, I'm Mark Scala, the Chief Curator at the Frist Center for the Visual Arts. We are in a perpetual strategic planning mode, and one of our strategic goals is to use technology where possible and appropriate in the galleries, and to kind of assess the resources required, you know, staffing and financial resources required. And we have a curator of interpretation who does a lot of this now, but we've asked ourselves if we need to have a curator of technology. And I'm just curious to know if anybody does, and where that person resides, whether it's in the education department or the curatorial department, or is it a standalone? Does this curator organize exhibitions relating to technology, or just work very closely with the various departments in integrating technology, again, where appropriate and desirable into the exhibitions?
I'm not, does anyone have a curator of technology in their institution?
We have an information architect.
An information architect?
I like that title very
That
much.
sounds very
We reserve
forward
we
thinking.
reserve curator for curators.
Yes. Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, when you know Target, it curates their shows.
What is Chan?
I think you know, I would make a distinction between technology and digital media, and I think that we need to be acquiring digital artworks, digital experiences, this sort of stuff, and there is definitely a role for a digital curatorial position in a very traditional curatorial sense. But in all my work around with institutions, helping them think about digital and the impact on the museums and libraries predominantly, my general recommendation is to move digital into curatorial areas and out of the IT department and out of the marketing team. Digital works across the institution and impacts on everything. And I think, you know, that's where you get the longer term structural changes that allow you to adapt to scale and to change better. Otherwise, it ends up being another silo. And I think, you know, at Powerhouse, we actually moved the organisational chart to more of a networked model rather than a tree. Practically, though, there was a lot more that needed to change, but that sense that digital was separate and worked across the institution meant that it wasn't tied to the plumbing, i.e. the network pipes and the computers that break, and it wasn't tied to the short-term initiatives that marketing teams usually do about we need more people at this exhibition or this book isn't selling. I mean, digital impacts across all of those, but the benefits come in the long term, not in these short 3-month things.
Thank
Don't know
you.
if that answered the question, but anyway, it's my rant. So.
Sarah Kianowski from the Harvard Art Museums. I'm sort of stuck on your Barr quote because, of course, we trained him. And I think Alfred Barr's idea of the laboratory was probably really about bringing a group of students into a room with a painting, like a chem lab, and talking about it. And the way that that's expressed in what we're doing now is that the head of our, we don't even call it education, academic and public programming, the head of our DAP department spends most of her time working with faculty across campus and encouraging them to use the collection. But I think of her as sort of a sheepdog. She rounds them up and brings them in, but then the curators are the ones who actually work with them and help them identify both which objects are appropriate for them to be teaching with, because they're often non-art history professors, although the art history professors sometimes need help too. But also just helping them with different ways of interacting with the collection, so that I've worked with someone doing a freshman seminar in First Amendment rights who was interested in censorship, and I sort of redirected her class to look at what it looks like for art to be made under an oppressive regime. So things like that we do that increase the interaction with of the students with the collection. And I'd like to think of participation not just in terms of technology, but in the way more traditional ways, which is to get people into a room looking at an object.
Absolutely.
And I think my question for Tina is, on a much smaller campus than what we're dealing with at Harvard, which is just, it's a factory, how does that play out at Williams?
What you're describing has happened very similarly. And I think your point is really good in terms of thinking about a continuum of participation, and that, I mean, this I think goes back to the point that I made, that I think that academic and university college art museums in some ways have a real leg up, because so much of what's embedded in them is a real practice of what you described, which is, you know, your public, your visitors, your students are right there, and you want to make the case for relevance, well, you have to make it, you know, the rubber hits the road right there, right, with your working with faculty around that. So I think our version is just a kind of a smaller version of yours. I think what's interesting is that, I mean, what's interesting to me, because I haven't been in academic museums that long, really only about a year, is that so much of the language and the methodology around how college and university art museums have made the case for themselves, for their own relevance, has been around formal education models, right? It's been around we're a global classroom, and we're a teaching museum, and we're the biggest classroom on campus, and like all of those formal ed metaphors. And I think what's interesting to think about is the extent to which informal learning is taking off across the culture, and seeing what's going to happen to that whole paradigm of relevance, if you will, right? That like, no, in fact, we're not just another classroom. We're really something else. We're really something that's in between, that is a kind of got a foot in higher ed and a foot in informal ed. And I think that's really rich and really exciting. Yeah. So, you know, I mean, I have a lot of optimism for what that will mean for the role of curators in those museums, what it will mean for the role of educators, how academic museums can really leverage this moment, you know, this 21st century moment. So,
thank you. Yes, hi.
There's real height issues with this thing. I'm Robin Jaffe-Frank, and I'm the chief curator at the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art, but I was until fairly recently actually a curator at the Yale University Art Gallery, so I have a past in university museums and a present in a very public museum, in fact the first public museum in the United States. First of all, I want to thank all of you for raising such provocative questions that have really made all of our conversations over wine challenging and exciting. And there were so many questions that have popped into my mind, and I'm sure so many of my colleagues here while you were talking, that I don't even know which one to ask. But we are now in the midst, like so many other people, of a major renovation and a reinstallation. And one of the things that we're thinking about on the simplest level, if we think of ourselves as not just teaching museums, but as learning centers, which I think you have rightly stressed, is what is the best way to reinstall collections, to make visitors feel welcome, comfortable in the juxtapositions of the galleries and the works of art within them. So the debate, of course, and one finds the balancing act for us in our discussions has been between organizing the collections. We've already decided that we're mixing all types of media, and that includes even things like costumes and rotating works on paper, as well as the traditional decorative arts, painting, sculpture, etc. But do we make the primary route through the gallery spaces chronological and cultural or geographic, or do we make it thematic? And where we are now in that balancing act is that we are thinking of reinstalling primarily chronologically and geographically, so that we can help our visitors better understand the artist and the works and the objects that they're seeing as an integral part of the culture in which they were first created and understood. But then we're taking thematic ideas that go across time and space, like, you know, conflict and resistance, or converging cultures, or the natural world, or things like that. But we're struggling with how to make those themes part of a conversation. What's the best way to make that conversation happen? And like a great many other people, we don't have a lot of money to spend on technology. So we would love your thoughts, or even our colleagues' thoughts on that.
Nina, do you have a thought about that? What's the best way to install galleries?
I have a lot of opinions on that.
Tina, okay.
Oh, maybe I can start, Nina, and then you can take it over.
Go for it.
For one thing, it's a big question, right? And I'm sure that we could spend the rest of the day in this auditorium talking about it. And I think what am I trying to say? it is too big a question. In other words, we put too much pressure on ourselves to come up with a narrative that will work for everybody and work for all of our objects. And I think in some ways, so much of what the last couple days have been about is that museums are all about the deep capacity of objects to tell multiple stories, right? And so when you try to tell one, and it's either geographic or it's thematic, inevitably stuff spills out and doesn't work, or there are publics who come in and don't want that story. They want a different story. And so somehow I think we have to, and this is the difficulty because objects require work to move and to install, and they're not fluid the way ideas are fluid or the way websites are fluid, but I think somehow we have to start thinking about that problem in a different way, because I think it's too self-limiting, it's too static, and it's too static for 2014. There's got to be a way in which our galleries are helping people understand like the depth and complexity of the stories that objects tell, and that whatever narrative we are laying out for them is one of many, or is a beginning narrative, right?
And transparency about that.
And transparency about that, yeah.
Okay.
And I also think that the way we think about our galleries, and trying to expand upon what Tina said very eloquently, this process that we have where we have a fantasy perfection, that we're going to sit down and we're going to plan something, and we have to make a major decision, like are we going to go down that road? Are we going to go down that road? And in fact, you don't really know where you need to go. And by having some conversations with visitors or trying, I sound like a broken record, but this is really, I think, profound, by trying things out and seeing even how they feel for you, rather than thinking that you're going to work for 5 years and then the curtain's going to go open, and you work for 10 years on writing labels, and by the time the labels are done, they're kind of out of date. But anyway, nevertheless, they're on the walls for another 20 years, and then we do the ta-da, and the curtain's open, and everybody collapses and goes on to the next project, when in fact, the process should be a creative process that's not like that, where you're learning and exploring as you're doing, and not necessarily, as Tina says, coming up with a whole different way to think about this. And the only way you're going to do it is not by sitting there and just plucking another idea out of the sky, but by actually having some experience with how these things are playing out and how people are responding to them.
Yeah, sort of prototype, test, evaluate, repeat. Endlessly and try it. I mean but if you don't do the evaluation, I think the bar quote as well, that sense of the lab. A lab is about experiments, and a lab is about testing hypotheses. But often I find that museums don't do the follow-up, which is, did it actually do the things we thought it was going to do? Where is the evidence? Technology can provide, because of its sort of surveilling nature, some new sorts of evidence. But the best evidence is qualitative research, and you can continuously do that. Being in the galleries yourself is very useful in understanding the ways different people approach things you think are very uniform, because they're not. So, test and evaluate is critical.
And I would
Nina?
just add, from the perspective of participation, can you guys hear me okay now?
Yeah, better.
Yeah? Okay, great. That just one of the things I always think about when doing these kinds of projects is looking for gaps that visitors or community members or specific community partners can help fill, in terms of, what voices aren't here, what conversations aren't we able to have with the team in the room. And, for us and for me, the design process when it comes to participation doesn't start with how we integrate this in or what do visitors want to do, but really starts with what are we missing here that visitors or that some particular group from our community can help add to this to create this whole story that we want to tell to everybody who comes in the door. And so I think looking at that opportunity for participants to solve your problems as opposed to them being their own new problem is, for me at least, a useful way to kind of flip that model of whether it's onerous or whether it's useful.
Yeah, good point.
Yes? Do you want to?
Oh, yes, sorry.
My name is Ellen Lee. I'm a curator at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And I want to thank all of you for the emphasis that you're putting on the participation and the ideas for it. I I think I got into museum work because, and I think this is true for many of my colleagues, because we believe very deeply in that engagement factor. And we don't work very hard to study a subject and not care whether anyone else gets it. You really want to see that connection, the participation is part of it. And this may sound quite defensive after this panel and the one yesterday, but in our zeal then to create experiences that will resonate with our visitors and encourage the repeat or encourage that epiphany, do you ever worry that as we do that, we may be losing some opportunities to share even more information with our audiences, and with the idea that as participants in a kind of learning community, that we also have an obligation not just to serve and to stimulate, but also to lead and to try to present new information.
Well said, and I think that is it's the balancing act and the choices a lot of us face, but it's not necessarily, it's not one or the other. It's got to be a hybrid approach that we've found that, and so I think it is a very relevant question to us as a field. We know someone mentioned shorter wall labels. I think 75 words is the going rate, but so what are those choices, and what is most essential to communicate, and how are you going to do that? And then how do you provide other opportunities for that deeper, perhaps, layers of information? So I think that's something for everyone to figure out, institutions figure out in different ways. We've heard some interesting presentations about with Dallas or Detroit, how they've been grappling with some of these issues and really being aggressive. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's a big question.
I also think that we have the wrong model in our minds. It's not like we should be starting at some kind of superficial level and then add in depth. I think we need to figure out how to start deeper and engage at a more fundamental level. And I think more often than not, people, when you get into this work, people are surprised by how deeply our visitors think and engage in the world around them. And we need to start in different places. I totally agree with you that we don't want that. But the superficial isn't here, and we don't live in the superficial realm and occasionally have an opportunity to go deep. We need to start deep and see where it takes us.
I'm Adriana Proser from Asia Society Museum and Asia Society overall, and I have a few different things to say, which I'm going to try to say quickly. First of all, my career in museums started at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I had a position at the PMA in the education department as a visiting scholar. This was just as I'd received my PhD from Columbia. And I was really fortunate in that I was working in a department that was run by Danielle Rice, who is well known for her innovative work in education. She also has a PhD in art history from Yale. And that experience, I think, was incredibly important to my later work as a curator. From the very beginning of my career, to engage with the public directly, in public of different ages, really helped in my formation and learning how to think about what are the questions that people have, where are the gaps of knowledge. There were questions, basic questions that members of the public asked of me that I couldn't answer despite having been in graduate school for 7 years. And I think that we run a risk, those of us who become curators who don't have that experience of, that's why people often think of us as being in an ivory tower, of being so disconnected, because I think the world of the graduate student to the world of the museum, where you're dealing with the general public, are, oceans apart. That having been said, I'm also, I love collaboration. I love collaborating with my colleagues, learned a lot from the public. But the elephant in the room here is, are we designing ourselves? Are we designing curators out of the museums? And I say this to you having, and I'm quite disturbed in a way because just a few weeks ago I had a conversation with a director, and the director said to me that she saw that the way museums were headed, that in the future she saw it was much more likely that museums would be probably trying to share curators between or among museums, and B, that they would be more likely to be using curators as consultants rather than permanent staff members. And I'd
That's
also
pretty bleak.
The final thing I wanted to say is that I've seen in my own institution, which is greater than a museum because it has an education policy, business programs as well, a disturbing trend over the last few years where the administration has thought that it's perfectly fine to take staff member X and move them from department A to department B, and think that they'll be able to do that job just as well.
Yeah, that's
And I think that museum education departments are incredibly important, and I think there's expertise there, just as there are in curatorial departments. And I don't think we can, I think we can learn from each other, but I don't think that we can turn a curator into an educator without the experience and background. It's not going to happen automatically. And I fear that there are some directors out there who may think that that's possible.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to comment, respond to that?
I will respond.
As a director, Tina?
Well, I mean, I can't speak to your conversation with the director, but I don't agree. I don't agree that curators are going to go away or that we're going to see a large trend of them working outside of institutions as consultants. I think that's a subtopic, and that's actually a pretty interesting one, and I think there is some of that coming our way, but I do not think it's exclusive to curatorial work. In fact, I think it's probably more likely to happen in other parts of museums than in curatorial work. We could talk about that if we want. But I do think that we have spent the last 2 days talking about the extent to which what curators do and how they're defined is changing, that is evolving, and pretending otherwise is probably foolish. And that is true for educators, and that is true for marketers, and we are in an incredible shift culturally, and museums are pedaling as fast as they can to catch up and to stay abreast, right? And so will the way that curators are trained change? Probably. Are they being asked to work differently? Are they being asked to craft forms that are different than the forms they might have thought when you were trained? Yes. I mean, I would ask the group to really think about what at the baseline, fundamentally, if you define what a curator is, what would you say a curator is and does that is absolutely the deepest part of the work? Is it about brokering an intellectual exchange between an object and the public? Because if that's it, then I think that's pretty good news, and that means you could be creating programs, and you could be creating exhibitions, and you could be crafting online experiences, and all of that is within the domain of the curator. If it is exclusively about crafting an exhibition exactly as we've all been defining, that is pretty traditional in its scope and goals, and that's it, then that may not be such good news. So I think there's a lot of questions to ask about forms and about for the field to ask itself really about what is that fundamental work. Back to the beginning of the conversation, I am sure that we will see a a range of different ways in which museums are collaborating or aggregating, and that will mean that certain kinds of positions will get shared. And I could see that happening with marketing, I could see that happening with back-of-the-house stuff like accounting and human resources. Designers.
It's everywhere.
You know, I think that is, I would be surprised if we don't see more of that over the next 5 or 10 years.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. What side of the room were we going back to?
I think you were.
All right, if it's or two fast questions, if you get right to the question.
I'll
yeah.
make this brief. Judy Fox, work independently with Ginger Duggan, organizing exhibitions of contemporary art and design and where they intersect. And it seems to me that there are 3 different points that are being talked about at the same time here that maybe it would help our thinking to separate them out. And one is that the kinds of strategies and programs that many of you have described and are very exciting, that enliven a permanent collection installation, something historic, and that's quite separate from the kind of artwork that a lot of artists are doing now, that where the engagement is the subject. When Amy Schlegel, the director at Tufts, came to us and said she wanted the gallery to be the heart of the campus, get the students off of Facebook, and we worked with Morgan Pewitt and Mark Dion and got a refrigerator, and they redesigned the gallery, and 17 different departments used that space. That's a different kind of approach. Lucy Orta and Jorge did the same thing, setting up a passport office. And that then leads me to this kind of, what do you do with the stuff left over? And again, there are artists whose work, like Li Ming Wei, really incorporates that, and I think we have to be careful that we don't become the artists. We aren't the artists, and that when we archive this material, all the post-it notes or whatever, they are not the work of art. They go into the archives, but unless the artist has designed that from the front end, I think that that's something to think about. What is the work of art, and how much the response becomes the work of art?
Thank you.
Can I speak to that for a sec?
Yes.
Because I actually really disagree with you in that I think that I think there are definitely opportunities in which we should be partnering with and supporting artists, especially artists who work in social practice. But I think we also, and I don't think about this as being specific to a particular role in the museum, but I think museums have the opportunity to take more of an active role as creative producers on our own. And you know, certainly this is something that Adam Lerner is doing very seriously at the MCA in Denver. This is something we're doing. It's something a lot of institutions are doing in terms of saying, yes, we do assert that we are part of designing the whole experience you have, and we're comfortable, at least at my institution, in saying that this participatory element is an artifact of the exhibition that is produced by us, but is comparable in terms of the experience that we're trying to support and the intent of why it's there, and we don't see it as a second-class citizen in that space. And I think that there are many different ways to look at this, but I think that we often shirk away from the opportunity to be creative producers, and we do ourselves and our visitors a disservice when we do that.
Amen.
Thank you. Emily, I think if you're all willing, we have, Sally just told me we can go over a few minutes because we started late, but it's, you know, please, if you need to stand up and stretch.
If you have to leave and rush out of the room.
Emily, if you had, they were waiting longer? Okay, someone's tracking. All right. Hi.
So I feel like a bit of a Margaret Mead, and I'm a little afraid. I'm a museum educator. So,
welcome.
My name's Suzanne Wright, and I'm from the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. I'm the director of education there. So I'm, you know, needless to say, interested in audiences. And I've been trying to work very hard with our curators, and I know that some are here, and they're awesome. And we had our gala last Friday. So I'm very curious about negotiating audiences that are public, as well as other audiences that the public doesn't see, like
donors,
your donors,
like
or my colleagues in the field. I feel like in programming, a lot of the work that my colleagues that are curators are interested in is working with their colleagues that have developed an exhibition. So the other authors for an exhibition, or other experts in the field. So I'm just really curious about how to balance this interest in a real variety of different types of audiences.
Well, we don't have a choice. I mean, we do have a lot of different audiences, and there is a much more customized approach. But we don't treat them necessarily as in silos. You know, I think that would be counter to the idea of creating a sense of community, and so. Yeah, there are a lot of audiences. There are a lot of demands on us as curators. I was thinking about Sal yesterday when he said, you know, factored into the big major work plan is no time to write a catalog. You know, I was thinking about with the kinds of work we do every day, and a lot of it is donor cultivation. Sometimes I say we all work for development because we are really, you know, a key piece of that. So I think we have enormous demands that, you know, as Tina said, we're there. And so I think it's for each of us to figure out how to you know, kind of maybe slowly change the model so that donors aren't in their own little basket or big basket, as the case may be. That, you know, we're growing different ways of getting to those ends. Anyone else? Kathy?
I recently did a project where we actually took into the donor event a prototype that was going out on the floor for a gallery, for an exhibit that was being developed. And some visitors also came to this event to talk about the experience. And the donor came up to me afterwards and said it was the most engaging, interesting conversation that he had had because he got to talk to people who he doesn't usually talk to. And they were talking about this third thing, which is the exhibit itself and the ideas themselves. And so I think when we put people into these pigeonholes of types of people, we lose the opportunity to have the crosstalk that's really interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the question, and thank you for being so brave as to come. Emily, did you have something? Or no?
I just wanted to know what was behind Nina Simon.
Oh, okay. Emily wants to know what's behind Nina Simon.
Okay, so back here, so we're in my office, and what's on this wall is a whole bunch of visitor comments, actually. So we, at our museum, we have in the lobby right next to the front desk, we have a wall, and it says, this is your Ma, and our museum's called Ma, and we have 3 different kinds of prompts. We have, how can we make the museum better? Write a poem inspired by your visit, and draw something you'd like to see in the museum. And so I read all of them. We recently had a teen advisory meeting in which these teenagers were just like blown away that anybody reads them at all. But we actually get a lot of program ideas from those, and what we do is it says on it, let me pull one down. How can we make the museum better? Fundraiser, local artists, designing and making pizzas, selling slices.
It's pretty good.
It's a pretty good idea. And so at the bottom of these, and unfortunately this person didn't do this, it says, if you'd like to hear back from us, leave your name and contact information here. Sorry, I'm not very good at controlling this. And so sometimes people will do that. And so, for example, we recently did this event called Luna Fest, which was a by girls, for girls film festival that was sparked by a teenager who put up one of those and said, I want to do this, and put in her contact information. So we use it for some exchange. And then also, you know, it's really important to us that this is a public practice, that it's not that you put your comment in a box and it goes to nowhere, but that it's on display in the lobby, and then obviously, you know, on display in my space up here as well. So I tend to keep the funny ones, the strange ones, and some of the ones that we've really acted on. I got a great one yesterday. Let's see if I can find it.
This is so great.
I don't know.
Nina, they're so neat.
Oh, here it is. This is from a kid. This is from a child. Write a poem inspired by your visit. Art is fun, soap is fun, the museum is fun, chickens are fun, and big pens are amazing. So high quality content, but it does inspire me. And again, just having those voices of those people has been really important to us in our practice. And incorporating, I'm thinking back to a couple of questions back, talking about this deepening. And I think one of the things we found for us is that by empowering visitors to explore their own creative expression, we also have been doing that with our curatorial team at the same time. So when we talk about wanting to tell those deep stories, for us that comes from doing things like moving to first-person labels and getting away from what's the essential fact about this object to what's really important you as a curator to share. And so kind of freeing all of us in terms of what the conversation and the dialogue is and how do we jump to that deep space, whether you're a visitor or a curator.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think that's a pretty good note. Oh, is there one more? Okay, one more. Okay. Hi.
I'm Claire Schneider. I'm an independent curator, and I love this conversation. I've been interested in participation since I started in museum practice. I should say my first job was at the Children's Museum right out of my art history degree at Tufts, hanging out with people on the floor in the Japanese house. I love that. And I just was thinking of how can I respond to all the conversations that have been happening. And I know there are people in the room who are uncomfortable with this conversation. I'm really excited and enlivened, I should say. I started as a curator, more seriously at the Albright Knox Art Gallery and worked there for 10 years and did many collection shows. But both that there are no curators on the stage is, I guess, a little upsetting to me, too.
New curators?
Okay.
Well,
No, did you say no curators?
Well, there's not as many curators. This isn't many of the people who are talking about participation at the curatorial meeting are not curators. And also,
They should be. They should be in those meetings. I mean, but
the presentations is what I'm saying.
Uh-huh.
So I'm just thinking, someone asked specifically, how do you deal with your collection? How do you tell these multiple stories? Part of one of the things I was able to do at the Albright Knox is there's so many certain prized and loved favorite pieces, and I got to rehang them so many times in different stories, sometimes in response to a great exhibition about very minimalist, monochrome painting, and talk about, put them with different things, or abstraction and identity, different, this was just, how can you, I almost want to say to the woman from the Wadsworth, can you pick one object and just to say, we're going to show this piece 10 different ways, and the next year, that's one thing. So that's,
this sort of
how
world
does
in
this
an object,
participation become a part of your curatorial practice? I'm also, a contemporary curator, so I often hire artists to do interactive things. But one of the things that's been on my mind as a curator, because I've given so many tours, I do it more in the asking model personally, because that's more exciting to me, is how can I do the scholarship as a curator with my knowledge from the visitor? And I struggled with a recent show I have called More Love, Art, Politics, and Sharing since the 1990s. How do I put the visitor's ideas on my book, in my page? And actually one of my dreams would be, I love Felix Gonzalez Torres, pick one person in particular. Certain artists, their job is draw out what the visitor thinks. That is what they want to do, but there's no scholarship about that. There's no anthropology about that. So again, how does the curator take their normal job, scholar, hanging the collections, and integrate that into participation? So I'm just kind of free-form riffing today, but bringing it back to how does the curator's role, the things they normally do, become a part of this? And of course, I love all these projects. Exciting to hear what everyone has to say. And it's exciting it's become more to the forefront.
I think, thank you.
Thank you.
As I say, I think it's for every institution to the degree they are capable and willing to start integrating these many thoughts. And, some will do radical change all at once. Others will do incremental, intentional change. And I think there's no one answer. There's no one size fits all. There's really just maybe here are some ideas that we've struggled with. I think what I like about today is that we've been able to really put on the table some things that, some of our real experiences, and maybe some pragmatic, ideas forward. So with that, I think we should wrap up.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much. Thank you, Nina. All right.
Thank you to the panelists. I just wanted to say a few things before you depart for lunch, just logistics-wise. For those of you who are attending public speaking, it happens in this room, and I'm going to give you a